Hi everyone, Steve here. Welcome to this edition of Monday Morning Musings. We are going to begin the wrap-up of this lengthy series, trying to convince you how Platonic the church is in its teachings about the body, the soul, and the spirit, and a lot of its doctrines of redemption in terms of your invisible soul going to heaven and so forth. We're going to wrap it up by taking a look at Paul's teaching on this subject. We've seen that in the Old Testament, the word soul doesn't mean the invisible part of you that goes to heaven when you die. We've seen in the intertestamental period, still the same thing with a little bit of variation. We've looked at all four Gospels. None of the authors of the Gospels refer to the soul as the invisible thing that goes to heaven when you die. So now we're going to come to Paul simply because his writings make up the bulk of the New Testament. There are spots of variation. These are brief devotional teachings. I can't get into the differences, like maybe how Peter uses a term a little differently or John uses the term a little differently. We're sticking with Paul as covering the bulk of the New Testament. And we're going to talk about body, soul, and spirit in Pauline usage. Now, one thing to remember when we come to Paul, he was raised a Jew, he thought like a Jew, he was a Pharisee who met Jesus in resurrection. And when I say Pharisee, I am not meaning stereotypical hypocrite, but a Pharisee who had a certain worldview and a certain perspective about things. And one of the things that the Pharisees believed in was the resurrection of the body. There is no dualism in Hebrew thought between the body and the soul. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament scriptures, the word for body is only used 14 times. And it's never used in comparison or contrasting or in hierarchy over the soul or suke. Never, anywhere. So this idea, again, that the body is this like an appendix, an add-on, a disposable commodity that has no bearing or no relation, no interaction, no integration with anything to do with our salvation is simply not true, not sustainable. Old Testament, intertestamental period, Gospels, and in Paul's writing. Paul was a Jew, and he would have the thought of the body being in conflict with the other parts of our humanity would never have existed in Paul. But what about those verses where he talks about flesh and spirit? And we're going to get to that. But we have to establish first that Paul held to what's called a modified unitary theory of what it means to be a human being, and we'll talk about that later also. Paul's use of the term suke or psyche more closely resembles the Old Testament era rather than the intertestamental period. So when Paul says something like, they seek my soul, he's not talking about the invisible part of his being, but somebody who's trying to kill him. And it is virtually identical to the idea of life or the totality of life or what makes up a whole person. But in Paul, a term advances and another one retreats. And in Paul, the big difference in Paul's usage of some of these terms is the term pneuma for spirit makes a significant or prominent presentation, and suke or soul recedes or retreats. And they are not interchangeable. Some people think they are, some people think they're not. I don't think they are. The simplest way to describe it in Pauline thought: the soul, or suke, is how a human being relates to one's self. The idea of self-awareness or self-consciousness, and all that contains, not just about like an invisible part of me that goes to heaven when I die. And then pneuma is the term that he uses in relationship to God, how a human being relates to God. And some people think that Paul's advancing of the term pneuma comes from his own experience, his own Acts 9 experience. and particularly because he uses the word pneuma to describe the Holy Spirit. It's the word that he uses to describe the Holy Spirit. And that is the most important use of that term in Pauline's writings. He uses the most for the Holy Spirit. But you're going to see in Paul's letters, you're going to see the term pneuma advance. And it's going to, at times, seem to be held in contrast with some of the other terms. And that's a bit of a unnuanced and a bit of well, how would I describe it? An unsophisticated look at those terms, because they're not adversarial. And that's one of the things we're going to have to unpack in this lessons coming up. Was then just as what Paul means when he says, I buffet my body, and the enmity between flesh and spirit, and soul and spirit. How does that all work? And like so many things that our beloved brother Paul says are difficult to understand sometimes. Look, I'm quoting Peter, of course. It's true. This area of Pauline psychology is one of the more difficult things Paul delves in, because like he often does, he takes terms and uses them the way no one else ever had and no one else ever has, and he puts a unique spin on some of these terms. So we just want to be clear as we introduce the Pauline side of things, that when Paul uses the term pneuma, he is not limiting it to just another synonym for soul, and it's the invisible part of yourself that goes to heaven when you die. And an example of that is when he talks about the second Adam has been made a life-giving pneuma, or a life-giving spirit. Well, clearly, the second Adam was more than an invisible being. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a spook. He had flesh and blood. He ate, he drank, he laughed, he cried, he wept. And so that Jesus, that incarnate Jesus, that second Adam became a life-giving pneuma. And so their pneuma, spirit, is referring to the whole person, the whole being, an integrated human being, not a partitioned human being with different compartments of existence. And in that human being, the life of God was found. The life of the Holy Spirit was seen in flesh. And I think that's why Paul uses the term. The second Adam became a life-giving pneuma, because in that human being, we see the life of the Father, the life of the Holy Spirit. We see it also in the story of the Transfiguration, when that life-giving being, that life-giving pneuma, that life-giving being, that pneuma of God, was manifest in mortal flesh. So that's just an introduction for kind of where we're going to go to wrap this up as we look at Paul's teaching on this subject. And I'll see you the next time.